Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar for the Sharpen Your Grant-Making Application Process. My name is Brad Ward. I'm the Director of Community Philanthropy with the Council on Foundation. We're excited to have you with us for this hour as we dive into some perspectives and experiences from the field on the application and the grant-making process. We're not going to delay. We're going to jump right into the next slide and take a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at. I'll give some introductions here in a moment, give some housekeeping tips, as well as you'll hear from a great group of panelists who have lots of knowledge, lots of perspective and insight to these various topics that you see on the screen today. If we can advance to the next slide, I wanted to just give you a few items. If at any time you need some help with this webinar, you can access the help desk. You simply select the help option. It's in your toolbar at the top of the GoToWebinar navigation panel. If you would like to ask a question of any of our presenters, you can just simply click the questions box and you can type that in there. We will be addressing questions at the end, so don't worry, we'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation, so submit them as they come to mind and we will be sure to address those at the very end to the best of our ability. If you need to exit the webinar at any time, just click the gray X button in the upper right corner and know that this is being recorded and it will be available in a few days after the webinar that you can access it on our website. If you have any other questions regarding telephone participation, you can be sure to use the landline if you're having issues with call clarity, and as far as this webinar, as I mentioned, it will be available. Jumping right into the next slide, I wanted to introduce you the panel of folks that have joined us for today. They'll give you a bit more about their background as we get into the presentation, but I do want to mention my co-moderator for today, the guru herself of the Knowledge Center, Stacy Frazier. She manages our Knowledge Center at the Council on Foundation. She's got a few tips and tools that she'll be talking about in a bit. For me, my background, I want to let you know that I too have come from the community foundation world, just as Stacy. I've spent time at a community foundation. I was the CEO for about 8 years of a community foundation in Indiana, where I led a merger of two, and certainly like all of you, just love this field and very pleased to be with the council, working hard to advance the community philanthropy. You'll hear more about their background, but I'm very thankful to have Joanna with the Albuquerque Community Foundation, Alex coming from the Community Foundation of Utah, and Jen Pendleton. She's coming from Allie's Early Philanthropy, and she too has background in running a community foundation. So we're going to jump right in. I know many of you probably, as you read the title and said, look, we love our grant making process, we love grants, so why are we starting with the application? And I think the fact of the matter is we start there because it all starts with what you ask for. When you're thinking about the grant making process and you want to sharpen it, I know many of you spend a great deal of time each and every year re-strategizing and rethinking about your grant making process. So why go to the level that we're here today with the application? And the bottom line is that we believe it connects to all of the needs assessments, the strategic planning, and the time and energy that you spend in trying to administer a good grant making process. So that's why we chose to start right there. No worries, this conversation will dig deep into thinking a little bit about the outcomes and about the outputs of our grant making process, and it'll give a good comprehensive look at about some strategies about how we can think differently. The goal here will be to help you be a bit more effective at simplifying, kind of maximizing, and getting the most out of your time and your funds in the grant making process. So we're going to move right forward to the next slide. Just a reminder, these slides are available. Happy to share them with you, and we've designed them in a way that you can take them to your board, to your grants committee, to your staff, and to your team to think critically about these issues, to dialogue. The intent was to ask questions so that we can talk about it in our own shops and try to get to the bottom of what we want to accomplish and how we want to do better. To set the stage for this whole conversation about sharpening the grant making process, it starts with the questions that we each ask ourselves. Immediately, you have to start with these core questions about when was the last time you even reviewed that application? How deep did you go into it? And the big question is, who did you engage in that review process? one critical factor that many people overlook is asking the nonprofits themselves. You are asking nonprofits to participate in this application process, so get their feedback, their input, and engage them in the process of analyzing the app. It's a challenge sometimes to be thinking about putting ourselves in their shoes, but it certainly gives us some end goal keys when we figure out the end user of who's using this application process. And there might be ways to streamline that process just by having that conversation about other ways to get the information it is that you seek. When you think about that end goal and what you're trying to accomplish with this, you have to ask the questions, and you have to look at the questions on your application and say, are they asking the questions that we look to achieve the results we desire? And what I mean by that is, if we have a needs assessment, if we have a strategy in place and goals established for moving the needle in particular areas of our community, is our application truly defining the measures and the areas of success that align with those end goals? Or is it a standalone process? Is it a standalone application that's not integrated into the rest of the work and the vision that we have? You're going to hear a lot of really good ideas and good insight when we get to Alex and Jen on that particular question. The other immediate question that I think all of us want to make sure we're asking is, are we drowning in paperwork? I know that sounds redundant, but it absolutely is something that all of us find ourselves trying to manage, this amount of paperwork. We have to ensure that we're seeking, that the questions you seek are rooted in the paperwork you actually need to properly assess the outcomes, to align your funding with the priorities and align it with the goals and the desired outcomes that you expect, but also those of your grantee. If you don't need it, this is a great place to don't ask for it. A lot of times we ask for information and then all we do is file it away. We're not actually utilizing it in some kind of other process. And so those are simple ways that we can look to eliminate paperwork where it's not needed. If you're using a system that allows you to gather information right away, is there a way to store that information from application all the way through the process of reporting so that the nonprofits and the grantees don't have to duplicate the information that you already have on file? Do you really need, questions that you can ask yourself about paperwork is whether or not you really need financial statements for the charity you support. If you support them from year to year and you know them, is GuideStar and the 990, that's public information that you can access at any time, is that sufficient for you to investigate from time to time as it's actually needed? You can't always get the data, so obviously if there's something in particular that you're looking at, that's where it applies to your application. But you have to ask things simple, like things like, do we really need a board listing? Is that available on their website? If it's not available on their website, this might be an opportunity to move the nonprofit field forward in transparency and clarity and access by encouraging them to list it on their website so you can easily access it when you want. There are tremendous tips and awesome opportunities to look at this a little bit more deeply. If you just go on the cof.org website, again, that's cof.org website, just search for Project Streamline, and you'll find some great resources that are out there around this topic of drowning in paperwork, distracted from purpose, and there are several other research papers that have been done that have helped community foundations really get to the basics of what they need to be asking for and for tips and tools about how they can get better. So I want to encourage you to take a look at Project Streamline, because I think as you're asking these basic questions, it will help along the way. I'm going to move right on to the next slide. So this is a little bit of to have a little bit of fun as we're starting to think about the application process, to think about the grants. You got to ask yourself, what kind of zoo are you running? Or moreover, what kind of zoo do you want to run? Does your app say something about your foundation? If you are the gorilla in the room and you're telling people how it's going to be, is your application sort of setting that tone? Are you a bit more like a flamingo? You're kind of dancing around the problem, you're too finicky to get to any substance, or you're just simply going with the flock. You're just asking the questions that everybody else is asking because that's what everyone is doing, and it's not getting down to what you want and what you need and what the nonprofits really can benefit from. Then there's the chameleons in the room. You know, they're consistently changing whichever way the wind blows, and then there's no consistency. The grant makers don't know what you're going to ask for next, or which direction you're going to be turning. And if you're engaging them in the process, as we talked about in the other slide, if you're engaging them, it's a little bit more difficult to be a chameleon because they're going along with you. The final zoo animal that we have here that you got to ask yourself is, are you the turtle in the room? Are you the one that's just too slow to be relevant to their needs? Are you not immobile? Are you too immobile to adapt? Are you not flexible enough to think differently and to ask a different set of questions to get you where you want to go? So if you stop and pause and ask your team and your grants committee what kind of zoo animal you are, maybe it will give you a chance to think a little bit differently. The key takeaways here are that, look, grant seekers, the grantees, they want clear, specific, they want revealing guidelines that help them determine whether it is or it's not worth their time to apply for this grant. And so the more that you can give that to them from the onset and think about the guideposts and the guidelines and the clarity in which, and not worry so much about what you don't do, but what you really want. And focus more on what you want rather than what you don't want, because if it's a true conversation, you can help clarify that in the end, and you don't have to spend all that time up front. The end is people want communications with real people. They want to be able to offer honest feedback, and if you don't have that conversation, you don't have that front person that can take the time to talk to people. It may even be the person who answers the phone. It may be the administrative assistant or secretary. Have them have enough familiarity with the process that they can communicate as a real person with the grantees and encourage those calls and encourage that input. I'm going to move on to the next slide, just a little bit of setting the stage, and I'd like to now turn it over to Stacy, who I mentioned herself is she's with the Council on Foundations but has a background in Community Foundation. She's going to share a little bit about our Knowledge Center.
Thank you, Brad. So as Brad mentioned, I have a background in Community Foundation work, but I also have been on the grant seeker direct service side of the nonprofit coin. And so it is important to be considering and having this conversation about how you can serve both parties in this process. And there is a way to get to that point. The Knowledge Center here at the Council offers some practical tools and building blocks for your grant making practice. And so I wanted to draw you to a specific resource guide that we recently published, which is the grant making application process, a grant making primer. It's available on our website, cof.org, and then you'll find it under the resources section. And what this offers is as the title suggests, a primer, which are the basic building blocks and components of a grant making process. So this will be of particular help and utility to newer foundations who have just entered the grant making business, and takes you all the way through the request for proposal process to the applicant checklist, some sample starting questions to ask, and then sample documents and templates, the grant acceptance letter, grant declination letter, etc. So in addition to this primer, we also have a lot of other resources on topics related to grants management, including grant evaluation, grants to different organizations, including rules around grants to non-charities and grants to individuals, and there's a lot of nuance there. So the Council's Knowledge Center can help you navigate some of those complexities. The easiest way to reach us is to email knowledge@cof.org with any question related to grants management or a variety of philanthropic practice topics, and we'll help you navigate and get to the answers you need.
Thank you, Stacy. And just a reminder, it really is that simple as just sending an email. There is no shame in asking where to find something or the best way to locate it. You know, like any good resource, it becomes complex simply by the amount of research and the amount of knowledge that is there. So that's what Stacy, that's what I'm here for, is to try to help navigate that. And it really is as simple as going on cof.org and typing in, you know, grant making or grant process or project streamline, and you'll get lots of good information. So thank you, Stacy. I'm going to turn it over now to Joanna Colangelo. She's from the Albuquerque Community Foundation. She's going to talk to us a little bit about her experience.
Thanks, Brad and Stacy. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Joanna Colangelo. I am the Grants and Community Outreach Advisor at the Albuquerque Community Foundation, which is a 35-year-old foundation in New Mexico. I've been here for about a year, and my background is fairly diverse, from journalism to fundraising and grant seeking, to also doing corporate philanthropy for a financial institution on the East Coast. So very happy to have landed recently in Albuquerque at our community foundation. I want to take a few minutes during this webinar just to kind of talk about something that we did here in Albuquerque, but really throughout the state of New Mexico, which was a different way of looking at a grant application and really looking at it in a nonprofit-centered way as best we could. So about a year and a half ago, the Community Foundation pulled together a group of funders to start a funders collaborative. And really it came out of two things. The first being that we ask nonprofits all the time to collaborate and to show us how they're collaborating and to show us how they're working together. But so often the funders aren't speaking and they're not collaborating. And so, we're often funding duplicative programs and leaving certain things to fall through the cracks, and it becomes a bit problematic. The other purpose, of course, is that New Mexico is one of the poorer states of the country. We don't have any major corporate headquarters, and we have a fairly modest amount of funders, and so it's a small enough group that many of us can get together monthly and talk about issues that are facing our various communities in the nonprofit world. And so during the very first funders collaboration, we discussed a number of different issues that were really hitting the nonprofits hard. And the first thing that really bubbled to the top was that nonprofits were spending an extraordinary amount of time writing grants, and oftentimes writing the same grants or grants that consisted of the exact same content, and yet they were doing it all throughout the year. And couldn't there be a way to streamline this process for them? Since so often the nonprofits were obviously using their own time and energy and expenses to do it, but sometimes going external and hiring grant writers and actually spending money and resources to work on these grants, and there had to be an easier way to help them do this and to save them time and money in the process. So the very first issue that the Funders Collaborative decided to tackle was developing an online common application tool for nonprofits all throughout New Mexico. And the first step in that was working with this group of funders who at the time was about 12, and we still meet and we're still working on various projects, which I'll get to, but that number kind of goes up and down depending on the months. And we decided to pull together all of our grant applications and really look at what we were asking each of the nonprofits. And to Brad's earlier point, what we realized was that we could cut a whole lot of meat out of this process. We had some funders come to the table with a one-page application. We had other funders come to the table with a 10-page application. And what we ultimately sort of settled on was something in between. But it was very eye-opening for a lot of folks, ourselves included, at the Community Foundation, that we could take a whole lot of content out. It just wasn't necessary and it wasn't critical. And that was in the application itself, but that was also in some of the attachments that we were requiring. And many actually having to do as well with the financials, which Brad had mentioned. So we worked together over the course of a couple of months to really hone in on what was needed, what were the common questions that were asked over and over and over again. Once we agreed on that as a group, we identified a tech platform, essentially, someplace where the common application could live, that could not only manage it technologically, but would also be a great resource for nonprofits to know about if they already hadn't been leveraging it, because they would have to go there to find their application. And that we were very fortunate to have Share New Mexico, which was already up and running and in development. Share New Mexico is the leading nonprofit resource in the state of New Mexico. If anyone's curious about it, it's sharenm.org. It holds thousands of nonprofits, registrations, financials, board information, mission statements. It also has data all throughout the state in various communities. It has grant cycles listed. It has essentially anything you would need to know as a nonprofit working in New Mexico. And so this was sort of a perfect opportunity. We were able to contact the folks who run Share New Mexico and go in to develop a whole separate part of that website that would hold our common application. In order to do that, of course, it costs some money. So this is where a lot of the funders really stepped up and said, okay, this is even beyond collaboration. We need to really put our money where our mouth is. And so for the first time, you saw funders throughout the state of New Mexico, not just the city of Albuquerque, going in on substantial funding dollars to develop a tool that would be freely accessible to not only the nonprofits, but to our fellow funders who could range from huge corporate funders to very, very, very small family foundations, private foundations in the state, to go on and leverage the common application and use it freely as they wish. So now we had the tool and we had the basic fields of what we were looking at. Before we could launch it in full, however, we did realize that there were going to be some questions that would be unique to each funder. And so what we were able to do was have a common page that once a nonprofit filled out a grant application for one funder in the state of New Mexico, that content would pre-populate for any other grant through any other funder throughout the course of the year. And so they would never have to go back and fill out things like the executive director's name or their mission statement. Once they uploaded the common attachments, things like their board lists or their operating budgets or their audits or their 990s, that they would never have to upload that again. It was done. The only thing they would need to do is the next step of the application, which each funder could go in and customize as their own, which is to say, when the funder needed a really specific piece of information, if it was an energy efficient grant, if it was an economic development aspect of a grant, that's where the funders can go in and customize those, and it's a very, very user-friendly tool. And so for nonprofits, you know, the feedback has been that it's saving them a whole bunch of time. For the funders, it's actually streamlining our process very, very quickly. So the tool had been developed. We had started to roll it out. We had tested it among nonprofit groups. We had gotten feedback. We tweaked it a little, and then we were ready to launch it. And we launched it at a funders fair, which is an annual funders fair in Albuquerque that holds over 200 nonprofits. And we kind of had an educational session around it, media campaign behind it, press releases, and really started to spread the word that this is the future for grant applications in New Mexico. It was an opportunity for nonprofits to see it in test. We went through the application. They were able to ask questions. There was a bit of an educational component. And then we just pushed it out on every bit of social media and press we could find. And what we saw was a lot of the nonprofits responding well, but of course a lot of the funders who maybe in the past had only used paper applications and were bogged down in that process started to use the online common application as their own kind of grant database in a sense, and using it freely and able to cut all of those costs tied to, you know, fairly robust online grant applications and those systems. So what we've seen, you know, the successes are we're sending a strong message to the community, which is that the funders are working together. We're trying to leverage our own dollars and our own resources to help nonprofits with their time, with their own resources, and we're really trying to put forth the message that we are nonprofit focused. We are community focused at this point. It's been streamlining processes both for the funders and the nonprofits, and it's been building stronger relationships between the funders. We had never sat down and worked together before, so this was one reason what we expect to see a much larger and continuous collaboration among New Mexico funders. You know, certainly some of the challenges were technological challenges, which we, you know, have worked out and continue to monitor throughout this process. But the really exciting thing is that the next phase, which is where we'll be working on a common reporting tool, which is not only, streamlining the process for nonprofits and making sure that they're only reporting on certain things and not having to duplicate reporting over and over again, but it's also looking at shared data among the funders. So we're all being very transparent with the data we're getting and the evaluation we're getting, and what we're looking to see is through this common reporting and through the shared reporting, can we identify places in the state and the city where there are gaps in funding and where there are gaps in programming, and that's really the next phase of all this. So that's been our little experiment in innovative grant making in New Mexico, and hopefully next year I'll have some information to share about how the reporting tool has evolved.
Joanna, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective. And for those listening, this is an opportunity. You absolutely can reach out to Joanna, and she's got a team of folks that are at the Share New Mexico and at her community foundation that can dig a little bit deeper into their experiences. And the unique thing is that you all are continuing to run your own databases and your own software. And so while that has presented some serious challenges, it's demonstrated that you've still been able to maintain your own accounting systems and so forth, and yet collaborate. And if you want to hear, Betsy Day, Elizabeth Day, but we go by Betsy Day at the Community Foundation of Frederick County, that's in Maryland. She's a member of the council who is taking a different approach where the funders are all getting on the same platform, and they're adding funders as they get ready to update their technology and their system. So they're not forcing anybody into it, but already them and the United Way and the city government and a few other funders have gotten on the same system so that they can use it as a peer group. They can have some leveraging power with the platform provider, and they too are coming up with a common process and a common application. But that's unique in the sense where Share New Mexico created a platform from the ground up, continuing to use their own system. So Joanna, thank you. I really do appreciate that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to move on to the next slide, and here's another different approach to your application process and to your grant making, and that is whether or not being competitive is the only way, which is where most of us operate, where we offer the application and we open it for a period of time throughout the year or at one particular time or quarterly. There's this idea that with a staged process and with lots of different techniques, you can actually move away from a one time a year or 4 times a year and literally just open the grant cycle up. And that sounds slightly crazy to some people. I can tell you that I had the personal experience, and it was a daunting task moving from a competitive process to this where we just accepted applications at any time. But what we found was that it met the nonprofits far better in their planning cycles and in their needs cycles than when we requested it on a deadline, because what we found was some even were just applying for the sake of applying, and what that meant then was that sometimes they were asking for things they really didn't need, or they were just creating new programs for the sole sake of making sure that they did not miss out on funding, and they were slightly chasing the dollars. And so for us, this became a way to meet them when they're budgeting and when they're thinking critically. And this has worked at our foundation, which didn't have boodles of grant making discretionary dollars, and it has worked at other community foundations that had millions to give away, and another one that only had 50,000 to give away. So you can scale it. It's all about expectations. And the question is what can it do to for your workflow to meet with those of the nonprofits? And that's a critical question we have to be asking ourselves, because what we find is that if we give them the opportunity to ask when they need it and when they're ready, it's more of a dialogue. It's more of a discussion, and it's not we're just submitting this application and hoping for the best, and then we're doing a grueling review process, but rather it's more of a partnership with the funding. Certainly when you ask whether an open grant cycle can work, you will have to think about how do we prioritize the funding. Money, can run out. In our experience, we found that we struggled to give away all the money, whereas when we had a competitive cycle, 2 to 3 times money was being requested than we really had. And it was partly because people were they didn't ask because there was a deadline in front of them. It didn't necessarily reduce the number of applicants, but it did spread them out more evenly because we saw that it flowed around their budgets, and it flowed around when they were starting to do some strategic planning and development work. It's not always beneficial, to the nonprofits when we have a set cycle quarterly or annually, and we just simply want to try to avoid having them bend to meet our timelines, which tends to mean they create new programs just to secure that funding. So be more than happy to talk to anybody about this idea around an open grant cycle. It can work. It can reduce your workflow, because rather than one time a year getting so jammed up, or 2 or 4 times a year, it just allows there to be a bit more even flow, and it gives you a chance to try new techniques. You can try simple letters of inquiry or an online inquiry form prior to inviting them to that full proposal, which gives you a chance to rule people out before they've invested significant time going through that whole grant cycle process. So again, happy to talk to anyone about that. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Jen Pendleton and Alex Eaton. They're going to kind of co-collaborate on this final section. So Jen, I believe you're up first.
Great. Hi, everyone. So while I am an advisor in Central Indiana with Allie Sterling Philanthropy, I'm also former CEO of the Community Foundation of Boone County in Indiana. I also have a background with a $30 million National Educational Foundation and a Children's Hospital Foundation. So speaking to you today both from past experiences and best practices. So I will also preface that some of the things that Alex and I are going to talk to you about are very aspirational in nature. This is something that we're even continuing to strive for today. So please keep that in mind, and this is just something to work toward and get better at every year. So let's look at a more of a bigger picture approach to your application. So we all hear about outputs and outcomes, right? And we're all looking at how do we establish a grant cycle complete with criteria and application that produces those outcomes that we seek. And it's important to distinguish outcomes versus outputs, with outputs being the easy things to look at. This project or program happened, this number of people participated. But sometimes we gather that information and then we never really follow up. But if we decide we want to track outcomes, we're looking at establishing criteria or needs at the onset of the application to see if the project or program funded is going to move that needle in the area of societal change that we seek. So whether it's poverty, educational attainment, quality of place, we need to be able to articulate what success looks like before we even get there and know that you've moved the needle. So that is your outcome. And so is your application leading to the right measurable? So when Alex and I were collaborating, we realized that some on the call may not necessarily have these large discretionary pools of funds. Some of you might be heavy in donor-advised funds. But we realized that the same rules can apply, just in different ways. So if we know needs up front, we can ensure we're educating donor advisors of those outcomes that we seek and invite them to participate. It might not always work, but it can show your foundation's position of leadership in the community and instill confidence, even if they don't participate. But if you do know the outcomes you desire, your application criteria should obviously reflect that. And depending on how large of a priority this is, the outcomes in your community should be reflected in your foundation's strategic plan. And I'll also point out that that's congruent with the council's standards process, which includes not only being knowledgeable of needs, but also having that strategic plan in place. This also ensures that your board leadership has discussed and kind of blessed this as an organizational and community priority. And the development of the application, which includes criteria and needs, can be a team sport. So on the next slide, we'll talk about what I mean by a team sport. And it means inviting the community in some way to have a voice in what they feel the needs are. So I know this isn't a needs assessment webinar, but I do want to take a few minutes to discuss how this can be an important process to consider. A few things. Now, you don't necessarily need to do a full-blown assessment. Many hospitals, health departments, state education boards, United Ways, and other organizations are required to keep various data. So if you can get your hands on this data, you can potentially find out where the gaps are in your community. Enlist a volunteer expert to help you sift through it. We work with our local United Ways retired director of research. We got really lucky, and he helped us compare our information to state benchmarks to help us know where we were in certain areas of our community. So having this expert knowledge and sharing it with your community also positions you as an expert on the needs and as a credible leader for social change. This is also great for fundraising. Then consider inviting the community to share with you what they think the needs are. This can be an online survey, but in some of our key communities, we had a listening tour, receptions where the public was invited to share their thoughts. You could also set these up as focus groups. Now, what happened is this anecdotal information ended up being very important next to the hard data to fill in some important gaps. And we heard two constant recurring themes. That it seemed like we had a lot of organizations doing the same thing, a duplication of service, and the Community Foundation seems to fund a lot of handouts, and people would like to see more support for programs that truly get people out of poverty for the long haul. So we ended up revising our grant criteria to reflect that preference would be given to organizations working collaboratively to address root cause solutions. And this is something the data never would have told us. So take the time to also ask the community not just the needs, but also solutions. It can help them get involved and puts you in a position to go back to your community and say, we listen to you. So just some tips on how to get around that needs assessment if you don't have it. Next slide, we're going to talk about the strategic plan. You might wonder why we're talking about this when we're here to learn about grant applications, but a few reasons. In the shift to measure outcomes, we're many times talking about community philanthropy and leadership, and you need to be sure your board has had strategic discussions about the role your foundation needs to play in the community and that this is reflected in your plan so that you give it the time and attention you deserve and that you're looking over those outcomes over, say, a 3-year period. So real change typically needs time to see that result. And then compared to your other strategic goals, where do these outcomes fall in terms of priority within your strategic plan? Should these become a grant priority for your organization? Are you looking at one big project or theme to adopt, like homelessness or higher education, or are you looking at multiple projects on a smaller scale? This will help you understand how to budget your time and resources based on the scale and the priority. And then how do these discussions or decisions impact our application? What do we need to ask for to ensure we get what we're looking for? Are the changes big enough that it will require outreach and education? Obviously, depending on what you're doing, this can be a cultural shift for your organization if you've not played this role before. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the impact on your grant criteria or guidelines as well. Obviously, they need to align with the goals and outcomes that you seek. It's going to require some education with your grants committees, the new goals, making sure they understand the data and thought behind it with an updated process or matrix selection, and really helps your foundation say, hey, we listened and we're addressing the needs. Next slide, we're talking about impact and ultimately shifting to an outcomes-based application that will require some behavioral changes you might not be accustomed to. So think beyond the one-year grant. Consider allowing multi-year grants if you're not already doing this. Also, as Brad said at the beginning, make sure you're including your nonprofit organizations for their feedback. They are in the thick of this, and they have great feedback for you. Partnerships are key. I think we have to acknowledge many times we're not the expert in the problem we're trying to solve, and this can put the Community Foundation in an awkward position. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that even as a funder, we may not have all the answers, and this has to be a true community partnership. So making sure that we have those experts at the table and that we're negotiating and agreeing upon the desired approaches and results. And the Community Foundation must understand and articulate and determine its role as a funder and a convener. And this is an important strategic board discussion. Be flexible and bring the community along as you go. So while I wish I could hand you all a grant application template that leads you directly to your desired outcomes, this is something is truly a discovery process for your organization. And there are many things you need to take into account. And I'm now going to turn it over to Alex Eaton, who has some very cool examples on how they're working in these collaborative partnerships for great outcomes.
Thank you so much, Jen. Why don't we flip to the next slide, just because the community partnership thing is something we're going to visit in just a minute. So my name is Alex Eaton. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Utah. I spent 15 years in high net worth investment management, most of those managing the Goldman office, the Private Wealth Management office. This foundation was formed in 2008, so it's one of the newer foundations. We have about $30 million in donor advised funds, so we don't have any discretionary funds. So Jen and I thought it would be an interesting case study to talk about how do you drive community impact and measurable outcomes when you don't have any control over the dollars per se. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been doing here in Utah, and that one of the community priorities that's been identified by the state is homelessness. And so we have 4 tranches into homelessness, the first being community leadership. We sit on a collective impact homelessness committee that's the mayors, the city and the county, it's developers, it's business, it's government, it's philanthropists, it's nonprofits, it's members of the homeless community. And over the last year and a half, we've agreed on 13 specific outcomes and how to prioritize resources and time as a collective team. The second tranche we have is advocacy. As a result of being part of that collective impact committee, we were at the legislature every Friday for 7 weeks asking for an appropriation for funds for 3 homeless shelters, which we were successful in doing, and that was completely a team effort with this group. The third tranche we have into homelessness is funding. All these different parties, whether it's the city or the county or Intermountain Healthcare or Goldman Sachs, they're all talking about homelessness. So what we did is we convened them in a committee, and we have a field of interest fund that addresses homelessness. So that's at the provider level, and we'll collectively decide, which providers are having impact, which providers to fund. And then at the very granular level, we became the intermediary, I'm sorry, this is a lot to throw at you, for a program called Pay for Success, which is essentially a social impact bond, and it's a private-public partnership to address social issues, but with very specific measurable outcomes. And in putting together this project, we realized, hey, we're a financial intermediary, but we're not a service provider. We're not even a funder. Do we have the expertise to evaluate and manage these providers and projects? And really, how do we engage government so that we're all working together? So that first slide you'll see, this is our team to work on homelessness. And Salt Lake County is really driving it, driving the state priorities. We're the special purpose vehicle in the middle, so we're the hub for the whole project. So, we help with, bringing in funding. The county actually selected the providers that are dealing with homelessness, which is the road home. They determined which populations they were going to serve. The University of Utah actually has specific data and measurements of whether or not they're serving those target populations, how the outcomes are measured. And then we have a project manager and an external consultant who help drive the project and leverage resources nationally in terms of, how do we do this effectively and efficiently, and because there's several other models out there of Pay for Success. Why don't we go to the next slide, which really gets in the nitty-gritty of what we're really measuring. So I kind of started at a high level of how do we engage all the different populations around this community priority? What's the right partnership model? And in the end, this is how we're going to measure the success of what we're doing within homelessness. And as you can see, it's really specific, in terms of, the metric, the description, the success rates. And then actually the interesting thing about this is based on the success rates, Pay for Success basically pays back the original investors. So you have private funders who pay for the project. You come up with metrics of how the project is going to be measured, and then if we succeed at the project, the county will actually make repayments to the original investors. So it's kind of an interesting model. And the other piece is we actually are pursuing federal funding based on this model to actually put these kind of metrics around the providers that are funded through our field of interest fund around homelessness. So I guess as a community foundation, we sit in the middle of all these people doing great work, and how do we collaborate, really hold each other accountable, have real conversations, and really determine, where to focus, when to focus, how long to focus, and at what point do we say, okay, we made a difference, and at what point do we say, let's move on and do something different. So I kind of got through this section pretty fast, Brad. So maybe I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think these are terrific because they give us real fundamental, case studies and examples that we can take a look at, and certainly these can be applicable to various types of grant fundings, and it gets back down to the types of questions that we ask for applications and their relevancy to the outcomes that are being measured. So kudos to you and Jen as always for that. I think this gives us the perfect chance to use the extra time to field some of the questions that I know Stacy has indicated are coming in. Certainly I do not want to, always want to encourage folks to remember that at the cof.org or the Knowledge Center you can get that one-on-one help, but the Philanthropy Exchange is another way to have these conversations, continue to engage your peers in conversations around this. There are communities that are dedicated to grant making and programming, as well as broad-based community foundation communities on the exchange, where you can post questions, you can research old questions, you can see what people have uploaded, related to those questions. So please don't forget, the conversation should and can continue, and it's as simple as asking a question, and no question is silly. And if you ever want to know how silly a question can be, you can just ask me, because I have posted plenty of those in my career. But I don't want to be outdone, or I want to be outdone, so please give that a go. So Stacy, can I turn it over to you and see what kind of questions we've had from our attendees?
Sure. Let's go back up to a couple of questions that came in around Joanna's presentation with the common application. The first one is from Lauren Nissen with the Inland Northwest Community Foundation in Spokane, Washington. The question, Joanna, is what other funders were part of your collaboration? Community foundations, private foundations, other types?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was all of the above. So the original working group was a mix of community foundations, our corporate foundations here, our local gas electric company. We had the County of Bernalillo, which is the county in which Albuquerque sits, and then we had some of the state's largest private foundations were also involved in that. So it was really a cross-sector group of funders who got involved and kind of put our heads together, and the United Way, of course, was involved as well as a community.
Great. And again, for you, Joanna, a question came in from Jessica Tudyk from the Amarillo Area Foundation in Texas. The question is, did multiple funders in New Mexico use an electronic grant management software? Was there an issue with funders using different grant management softwares, and if so, how did you address that?
Yes, another great question. So we've seen that, gosh, we've seen it across the board in different ways. So we've seen funders use the application who have never used an online grant application at all. So that was a great first step for them. We've seen folks who used a platform, they were using Gifts Online. Currently, Gifts Online doesn't have the API that speaks to Share New Mexico. That is about as far as my technological span. But the funder that used the common application that was using Gifts Online was actually able to find a workaround and was able to import the data through their common application into their Gifts Online in a way that, I'm not going to lie, was a bit more labor intensive for sure than it would have been any other way. The group that used that was a leading funder here in New Mexico, and they felt it was critical to take a stand and be one of the first folks to leverage the online application, so that's why they did it. but it was a challenge. And then we've had other groups that use online applications, their own grant management systems, I should say, that speak very easily to Share New Mexico, and that was it was a seamless process to get the data back and forth. What I will say is that the team at Share New Mexico, the group of funders, and Gifts Online, I guess it's now Blackbaud, I think they all merged, or MicroEdge, has been working very, very closely to develop the API, whatever the translation service is needed, so that they can all speak to each other, knowing that Gifts Online is one of the largest grant management software systems there is. And we just heard actually a couple of weeks ago that it looks like in 2017 they'll have that piece in place, which would make this whole system fairly universal at that point across New Mexico. So we're excited for that. But you nailed one of the biggest technological hurdles that we faced, which was getting all of these things to talk to each other.
Thank you, Joanna. Switching over to Brad, member question from Amy Putzer from the Oshkosh Area Community Foundation in Wisconsin. How do you involve volunteer grant committees when using an open grant cycle?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it actually looks very similar to the process of the competitive, but from the onset you're asking them to be more flexible. And one of the ways that we did that was we set up bi-monthly meetings so that we already had them on the calendar, and that was in it. And then we used the time in between, so which was about 45-50 days, to stay engaged with the nonprofits, to get the applications really cleaned up and to the point that we wanted to present them. And then we went ahead and gave them to the grant committees in advance to start reviewing and having conversations, but we didn't have them competing against each other. We had them going against the merits that we set aside as an organization from the beginning around what are we looking for in funding, what kind of expectations do we have our funding will support, what kind of outcomes are we looking for, and how can our grants, you know, align with that. So a lot of work had to be done on the front end for us to get very clear, very concise about what we were looking to fund in that particular year. And we typically tried to stay consistent from year to year, but we had some slight alterations based on what funding was available and what we were trying to tackle within our needs and strategic plan and our needs assessment. So for the volunteers, they knew they were going to get together every other month, whether there was one application or 7 applications. And if the applications became, because again they were evaluating the merits of each one individually, if they become significant, we would ask for an additional meeting in between there, and we would just ask for a quorum. And so we made it very clear that because we were asking for as many as 6 to 8 meetings a year, we by no means expected them to be able to attend all of them and to review every single application. So in that case, we also did add 2 additional members to the committee to try to give some flow there, some consistency, given that we weren't coming together. But I will tell you that the feedback from the volunteers was they would much rather meet more frequently and have real good-hearted debate about the merits of an individual applicant than trying to review countless of numbers of them every quarter or twice a year, and basically making that more about, well, this one deserves funding over this one. It really became a matter of priorities about what aligns. And then the conversation wasn't pitting applications together, it was pitting about how do we successfully diversify our funding and how do we successfully invest in different ways. So for us, it was resetting the expectation for the volunteers that we'd meet more frequently, but we would have more debate at each one, and to ask them to engage more frequently. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yep, and a related question on the ongoing open grant cycle from Aaron Andrews, the Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin. What staff support did you have to manage the ongoing communications with grant applications?
So we utilized our program officer, And then we also utilized our administrative assistant to be, we kept the administrative assistant very much in the loop about what we were trying to achieve, how to access things, and essentially to be the frontline communicator to the grantees via email and phone call when they were engaging, so that our program officer could focus on the grantees that were in the process. And we treated this very similar to how we treat donors. We prioritized our funders. We were not shy to prioritize them internally. We tried to be as transparent about that as possible, but I would venture to say that we internally knew that, you know, these were the priority funders that are the priority grantees, and these are the ones that we know we want to be working with. These are the ones that we want to hear from. These are the ones that maybe we're not quite sure yet what our relationship or partnership looks like. So we treated them like relationships. We also were not shy about the fact that we favored, I wouldn't say that we tipped the scales their direction, but we favored the time we spent, at least, with those who had also invested in the community foundation. If they had their own agency endowments, or they had been working with us to bring designated funds from donors, they had been talking to us about their own planned giving and their own development, then we felt that we had reached a new stage of the relationship where we were real true collaborators and partners, not just in how we used our money, but in how we grew those assets that are available to them. So I would say that we used 2 staff persons, and we divided the work into those who field the questions and navigate the application, and those who are really working towards finding the right fit from the funder that actually meets our funding goals and objectives, so that we didn't waste anybody's time.
So Brad, looks like this may be right for a topic for future resourcing. We have some additional questions and interest in hearing from community foundations who have adopted an open grant cycle. So something we will take back and consider following up with an additional resource on that topic specifically. Let's shift to a few questions for Alex. The first from Aaron Andrews with the Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin. And Alex, the question is, do you have suggestions on how to engage donor-advised fund holders to help address community needs through their grant funding? And we can open that up beyond Alex.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Brad, I've been here a year, Aaron, and that's something we're really focusing on, because right now a lot of what we do is we just do what donors ask us to do, and our goal for the next year is really to understand better where donors have interests, and then meet with them more often and link those to community needs. The other thing we've done is we've put together a Grant Makers Forum. I'm sure a lot of people have this, where it's the largest private foundations in the state, and we're convening them on a regular basis to share best practices and talk about community priorities and kind of the concept of philanthropy in collaboration. I don't know if someone else wants to take that.
This is Jen. At our foundation, we instilled a process once we had our criteria and applications updated. We ended up asking our donor advisors if, when we received the grant applications from our competitive process, if they would like to review them themselves in case they had an interest in making a grant in one of those. And since our criteria was now aligned more with the community needs, we had several fund advisors who ended up designating their contributions to those projects. So it was a slow shift for us. We were just starting to kind of turn the corner when I left, but we had success in just understanding if they wanted to hear from us.
Looks like we have time for one more question. We had a couple around, again, to Alex, related to the Pay for Success model. And Pilar Olivo from the Community Foundation of Frederick County, Maryland asks, what is the scale of the dollars involved in that program, and the scale and absolute numbers of people targeted by your metrics?
Great. So it was $1.2 million to develop the project. The project is going to be $11 million. Half of that is dedicated to homelessness. There are approximately 250 people that are designated, and a lot of it's around housing, and this is a 5-year project.
Okay, and I'm going to try to squeeze in a last one here from Karen Demarest, also to you, Alex, from the Community Foundation of Sonoma County. Did you work with a consultant to develop your Pay for Success model? And additionally, how did you develop your data sharing agreement?
Great. So the project really has been driven by the consultant, which is called Third Sector in the county. And we've really just been engaging like Department of Workforce Services, the prison. I mean, data sharing has been a huge thing in terms of getting everyone on the same page, because it's usually the same super utilizers. So that's just been an ongoing process of having dialogues with the right people and getting everyone on the same page, that we have the same goals and we're serving the same population. If you want more detail, we should probably talk offline.
Okay, Brad, you want to take us home?
Yeah, I feel like Alex. She knows how to wrap it up. Look at that. She's far better than I am. So, look, these are great questions, and I really do appreciate the input that we're getting from the participants. And of course, with a webinar, there's always those limitations. And so I thank you for that. Do not hesitate to follow up with any of us as presenters. I know that they are eager to continue to talk about this. You certainly can reach out to me, and I can help get you connected if it's a question that I cannot answer. The Knowledge Center is there for you, and the exchange is such a great place to keep these conversations active. So if your question did not get posted or get revealed by Stacy, take it to the exchange and just post it, and let's see what transpires. We'll see what our colleagues have to say about this. So with that, again, Joanna, Alex, Jen, Stacy, thank you so much, and thank you to our folks back at the Council on Foundations, particularly Storm Gray, for her kind work in making this call happen today. We are here for you if we can help you. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.